Okay, so let's get to enforcing ethical standards in the workplace. Okay, and we'll present 7 steps from Larry Ruddle here. There's by no means the only way that you can do it, but I think this is a good thing to ask yourself and kind of reflect on your own organization and say, first, recognize the standard has been violated. Sometimes that seems easy. If someone was stealing pens from work or we're always punching out 15 minutes early, that kind of behavior is more recognizable. But some more subtle things may not be. And there's a term called creepy normalcy that Jared Diamond has, cultural anthropologist. He definitely has talked about that. If you've ever read his book Collapse, he talks about that a lot. And what creepy normalcy means is if you have a tree, say you have a tree out in your front yard, and every day you go out and cut one branch off, people probably aren't going to notice that that tree is being cut down. And over time, eventually, it'll just disappear, and probably very few people would notice that. But if you went out with a chainsaw and just hacked it down in one day, probably more people would recognize that. Okay. Okay, and so the next step is identify all affected parties. Again, that can be more difficult because sometimes there's third parties that are affected that weren't directly involved in the incident that can be affected. And a good example of that is, you may have contractors that work in your organization, or employees, spouses. Those are all people that could potentially be affected as a third party. Okay. Gathering all pertinent information, analyze the information against the company standards. It's always good to really ask yourself and not get emotional and ask yourself, hey, what's our company's ethical standards and guidance? What does it say? And was there a violation? And then, again, make a decision aligned with company policies. Okay. And I think if everyone understands in your organization what the ethical policies and guidelines are, it'll be much easier to enforce when there are violations. Okay. And then implement a decision and capture the lesson learned. I think the last part is probably the most important, is capturing lessons learned and making those visible to your employees. So if someone makes a mistake, hold them accountable for it. Make sure people within the organization who weren't involved are aware of what happened, and that can be as easy as an all hands kind of talk, or an email that goes out to everyone, or in the company news bulletin. And all those things are important because then people recognize that people are being held accountable for inappropriate actions. Okay, so the ethics enforcement cycle. Here's a little bit different take on it, and you see here kind of the cycle. You can start, depending on your perspective, you could start in the define category to assess risk, align policies. Really, that's just promulgating the company policies. Okay, and then you have the prevent, all the things you do to prevent unethical behavior, training, open door policies, workshops. Maybe you have a weekly memo or monthly memo that comes out and highlights some specific ethical dilemma, some kind of case study or something. And then you have the detect phase. So that assumes that your prevention measures haven't worked, and now you got to have something in place to detect inappropriate behavior. Okay, and that's not always easy. A lot of times people don't want to. You'll hear the term rat each other out, or they feel like I got to mind my own business. Okay, so all those things work against an organization trying to detect unethical behavior. Okay, and then the respond here, and I put a red circle around that. It's very easy for a company to make mistakes during the response phase and not really understand what the root cause is. That's probably one of the biggest. Is not to act emotionally, to take the proper actions, but to find out what was really the root cause. Did an employee not understand a policy? Did they just decide to make a bad choice? Do they have some personal issue in their life that caused them to do that? Did the company culture promote that kind of behavior and allow it? All those things are important questions to consider, points to consider. And then the last phase is kind of that feedback mechanism, is to evaluate, do you have metrics, measurements to evaluate how effective your ethical guidelines are? I think it's always important, anytime you have an incident, or even if you don't have an incident, to evaluate and say, hey, are our policies right, and do we have the right culture here to promote ethical behavior? Okay, and that's all we have for lesson 2.